The discovery of Michael Jackson's diary should have been the end of my investigation, but instead it became the beginning of something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. After spending 3 sleepless days and nights analyzing every word, every sketch, every desperate plea contained within those yellowed pages, I realized that the boy's final entry posed a question that haunted me more than any ghost story ever could. How had a 13-year-old child known exactly where to hide evidence that wouldn't be found for 22 years? The drawing of Martha Hendricks' house was too precise, too detailed to be coincidental or the product of childish imagination. Michael had never visited that property, according to every record I could find. Every interview I conducted, every database I searched through both official and unofficial channels. Yet he had sketched not only the exterior architecture with remarkable accuracy, but also internal structural details that matched perfectly with the actual building, the placement of support beams, the angle of the roof, even the specific location of a loose floorboard in the attic where the diary had been hidden. The arrow pointing to that exact spot, the words "hide here" written in his trembling handwriting, suggested a level of premeditation that chilled me to the bone and made me question everything I thought I understood about the nature of time, space, and human consciousness. This wasn't the panicked scribbling of a frightened child facing an unknown fate. This was the calculated action of someone who possessed knowledge that should have been impossible to obtain through normal means. Someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and was desperately trying to leave clues for future investigators who might be willing to listen to warnings that adults had dismissed as teenage paranoia. But how could a boy from 1985 have possessed such prophetic knowledge? How could he have seen into the future with such clarity that he could draw a map to a safe hiding place that wouldn't be discovered until decades later? The logical part of my mind, trained through years of criminal investigation and forensic analysis, suggested that Michael might have visited the house at some point during his family's numerous trips to the area and simply forgotten to mention it in his earlier diary entries. Perhaps he had met the previous owners, explored the property during one of their camping expeditions, and stored the information in his subconscious until the moment of crisis made it relevant. But the emotional part of me, the intuitive investigator who had learned to trust feelings as much as facts, recognized something far more disturbing in his final words, something that suggested forces beyond human understanding were at work in the swamps of Blackwater Hollow. The more I studied Michael's drawings and compared them to architectural surveys of the property, the more impossible his knowledge became to explain through conventional means. He had drawn details that weren't visible from outside the house: the internal support structure, the specific configuration of attic spaces, even the location of a small window that had been bricked up decades before his birth. These weren't details that a casual visitor could observe, but rather the kind of intimate architectural knowledge that only came from extensive exploration or access to building plans that had never been made public. I spent hours in the county planning office, searching through blueprints and construction records, trying to find any documentation that Michael might have seen. What I discovered instead was that the original building plans for Martha's house had been destroyed in a fire at the county courthouse in 1978, 7 years before the Jackson family disappeared. No copies existed in any public archives, and the construction company that built the house had gone out of business in the 1950s. Yet Michael's drawings showed details that could only have come from those lost blueprints, as if he had somehow accessed information that existed only in the memories of long-dead carpenters and architects. The implications of this discovery were staggering and opened possibilities that I wasn't sure I was prepared to explore. I decided to dig deeper into the history of Martha Hendricks' property, hoping to find some connection between the house and the Jackson family that might explain Michael's uncanny knowledge of the location. My investigation led me to the dusty, cramped confines of the county records office in Gator Springs, a building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration and smelled of old paper, mildew, and decades of bureaucratic neglect. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across rows of metal filing cabinets that contained the documented history of every property transaction, birth certificate, death record, and legal proceeding in the county since its founding. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the head archivist, was a woman in her 70s who had worked there for over 4 decades and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every property transaction, family feud, and mysterious occurrence that had ever been officially recorded in the area. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun that hadn't changed style in 30 years, and her wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of her nose gave her the appearance of a scholarly owl guarding ancient secrets. When I showed her the address of Martha's house and explained what I was looking for, her expression changed from professional courtesy to something resembling fear, a transformation so subtle that someone without investigative training might have missed it entirely. She removed her glasses, cleaned them nervously, and avoided making direct eye contact as she spoke. "That property," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "has a history that most folks around here prefer to forget." She disappeared into the back rooms for nearly an hour, and I could hear her moving through filing cabinets, muttering to herself in tones that suggested she was finding more than she had expected, or perhaps more than she wanted to find. When she finally returned, she was carrying a file folder so old that the manila cover was practically falling apart, held together with rubber bands that had lost their elasticity decades ago. The documents inside were a mixture of typewritten forms, handwritten notes, and carbon copies so faded that some were barely legible. But what they revealed painted a picture of a house that had been the center of unexplained phenomena for generations, changing hands far more frequently than any normal property should. Built in 1943 by a family named Morrison, Harold Morrison, a railroad engineer, and his wife Ruth, a seamstress who took in work from the wealthy families in nearby towns, the house had been sold and resold no fewer than 17 times over the decades since its construction. Most owners stayed less than 2 years before abandoning the property, citing personal reasons in the official paperwork that were never fully explained in the accompanying documentation. But Mrs. Fitzgerald had access to unofficial records as well. Insurance claims, police reports, and local newspaper clippings that told a more complete and disturbing story. The Morrison family themselves had lived in the house for only 18 months before Harold died, in what was officially ruled an accident, but had circumstances that raised questions among local law enforcement. According to the police report, Harold had been found in his basement workshop, apparently electrocuted while working on a radio repair project. But the investigating officer noted that the electrical damage to Harold's body was inconsistent with the voltage available in a residential setting, and there were burn marks on the basement walls that suggested exposure to some kind of energy source that couldn't be identified or explained. Ruth Morrison had tried to stay in the house after her husband's death, but within 6 months she was reporting strange occurrences to local authorities with increasing frequency and desperation. Her calls to the sheriff's office, documented in incident reports that Mrs. Fitzgerald had somehow managed to preserve, described voices coming from empty rooms, electrical appliances turning on and off by themselves, and what she called cold spots that moved through the house like invisible presences. The final incident report, filed just 2 weeks before Ruth abandoned the property, described her frantic call to emergency services claiming that someone was calling her name from inside the walls. Adrien! When deputies arrived to investigate, they found Ruth barricaded in her bedroom, convinced that something was trying to communicate with her through the house's structure itself. The official report noted that no evidence of intruders was found, but it also mentioned that several of the responding officers reported feeling uncomfortable in the house and experiencing equipment malfunctions with their radios and flashlights that couldn't be explained by normal mechanical failures. The subsequent owners of the property had similar experiences, each documented in insurance claims, police reports, and medical records that Mrs. Fitzgerald had somehow managed to collect and preserve over the decades. The Patterson family, who bought the house in 1945, lasted only 14 months before their 8-year-old daughter began claiming that other children were living in the attic and wanted her to come play with them. When the Pattersons investigated, they found evidence that someone had been using the attic space. Blankets arranged as if for sleeping, food wrappers, and children's toys that didn't belong to their daughter. But there was no way anyone could have accessed the attic from outside the house, and their daughter swore she had never been up there herself. The family installed locks on the attic access, but within days, the mysterious items reappeared, and their daughter began sleepwalking, always trying to reach the second floor as if responding to some irresistible compulsion. Medical examinations found nothing wrong with the child, but her behavior became increasingly erratic until the family finally decided that living in the house was too dangerous for their daughter's mental health. The most disturbing entry in the property files was dated September 1985, just 2 months after the Jackson family disappeared. According to the meticulously maintained records that Mrs. Fitzgerald guarded like sacred texts, the house had been purchased by a man named David Chen, a reclusive writer from California who had paid cash for the property site unseen after responding to a newspaper advertisement. Chen was described in the real estate documents as a freelance journalist and author of investigative non-fiction, and the selling agent noted that he had been particularly interested in the property's history and had asked detailed questions about previous owners and any unusual occurrences associated with the house. Chen had lived there for exactly 6 months before vanishing without a trace, leaving behind all his possessions, several months of unpaid utilities, and a house full of research materials that would later prove to be directly connected to my own investigation of the Jackson family disappearance. When local authorities entered the house to investigate Chen's disappearance in March 1986, they found a scene that was both mundane and deeply disturbing. Chen's personal belongings were arranged throughout the house, as if he had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return within minutes. Fresh coffee in the kitchen pot, a half-eaten sandwich on the dining room table, clothes laid out on the bed, as if he had been deciding what to wear. But his car was found abandoned at the edge of Blackwater Hollow, with the keys still in the ignition, the driver's door standing open, and footprints leading from the vehicle directly into the swamp that stopped abruptly at the water's edge, as if the person making them had simply vanished into thin air. The police report noted that Chen's belongings in the car included camping equipment, photography supplies, and a notebook filled with observations about supernatural phenomena in the Everglades, that read like the work of someone who had been conducting a systematic scientific investigation of unexplained occurrences. But the most significant discovery was made in what had once been the living room of Chen's house. Every wall was covered with newspaper clippings, police reports, photographs, and handwritten notes related to the Jackson family disappearance. Chen had created what investigators described as a shrine to the missing family, with their photographs arranged in the center of an elaborate display that included maps of Blackwater Hollow, timeline charts showing patterns of disappearances in the area dating back to the 1800s, and theories about supernatural forces that he believed were responsible for the vanishings. Most significantly, investigators discovered that Chen had been obsessively researching not just the Jackson case, but dozens of other disappearances in the Everglades, looking for connections and patterns that official investigations had missed or dismissed. His research was remarkably thorough and included information that had never been released to the public. Details about the family's final days, their conversations with local residents, and even some of the contents of their abandoned van that had been kept confidential by law enforcement. Mrs. Fitzgerald showed me photocopies of some of Chen's notes, and I was shocked to see that many of his theories about the case aligned perfectly with conclusions I had reached during my own investigation. But Chen had also written about things that should have been impossible for him to know: private conversations between family members, details about their camping equipment that hadn't been mentioned in any news reports, and even references to Michael's diary years before it was actually discovered. One particularly disturbing note, written in Chen's precise handwriting, stated, "The boy knew what was coming." His diary contains warnings that future investigators will need. Hidden where only someone with the right knowledge would think to look, the house remembers everything. The implications of this statement were staggering, because it suggested that Chen had somehow known about the existence of Michael's diary and its eventual hiding place decades before Martha Hendricks would find it in her attic. But how could this be possible when the diary hadn't even been written when Chen began his research? Among Chen's research materials was a hand-drawn map of Blackwater Hollow that showed far more detail than any official survey I had ever seen, including geological features that weren't marked on government topographical maps and water channels that seemed to shift and change depending on unknown factors. The map included locations of what Chen labeled as convergence points, specific coordinates where he claimed the barrier between worlds grows thin, marked with precise GPS coordinates and detailed notes about electromagnetic anomalies, temperature fluctuations, and other phenomena he had documented during his own expeditions to the area. These points formed a pattern across the swamp that resembled some kind of geometric symbol, with lines connecting each point, creating a shape that looked disturbingly similar to diagrams I had seen in books about occult rituals and dimensional magic. The symbol was composed of interlocking triangles and circles that created a complex mandala-like pattern, and Chen had noted that the entire formation was oriented according to astronomical alignments that occurred only during certain times of the year. But what made Chen's map truly extraordinary was that it marked the exact location where the Jackson family van had been found, labeling it as the primary anchor point, and noting that it was where they first heard the calling. Now, according to his research notes, this location was the center of what he called a spiritual vortex, where the normal laws of physics broke down and consciousness could exist outside the constraints of linear time. Chen had also marked several other locations, with dates going back to the 1800s, suggesting that disappearances in Blackwater Hollow followed a cyclical pattern that occurred roughly every 7 to 10 years, always during specific astronomical configurations, when the Earth's position relative to certain celestial bodies created optimal conditions for what he termed dimensional permeability. According to his calculations, the Jackson family had vanished during what he called a peak manifestation period, when whatever supernatural forces controlled the area were at their strongest and most active. More troubling still, Chen's timeline indicated that the next peak period was approaching fast, and based on his astronomical calculations and historical patterns, it should have occurred around 2007, the same year Martha Hendricks found Michael's diary. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental, and I began to suspect that my own investigation had been guided by forces beyond my understanding, that perhaps I was following a path that had been laid out for me by intelligences that existed outside normal space and time. Chen's research suggested that investigators like myself weren't randomly drawn to the mystery of Blackwater Hollow, but were specifically selected and guided by the trapped consciousness of previous victims who were desperately trying to communicate warnings to the living world. This theory was supported by his notes about synchronicities and meaningful coincidences that had led him to specific pieces of evidence at exactly the right moments, as if an invisible hand was guiding his research and ensuring that he discovered precisely what he needed to know at each stage of his investigation. But Chen's research also contained increasingly paranoid observations about being watched and influenced by unseen forces, suggesting that prolonged exposure to the supernatural energies of Blackwater Hollow had begun to affect his mental stability and perception of reality. Determined to test Chen's theories and follow the trail of evidence wherever it might lead, I decided to return to Blackwater Hollow one more time, armed with Michael's diary, Chen's research materials, and a collection of specialized equipment that I hoped would allow me to document whatever phenomena were responsible for the area's sinister reputation. But this expedition would be fundamentally different from my previous visits to the swamp. Instead of camping in the area where the van had been found and hoping for random encounters with the supernatural, I planned to systematically explore the convergence points marked on Chen's map, using the GPS coordinates he had meticulously calculated and the detailed observational protocols he had developed during his own investigations. I also brought along state-of-the-art electronic equipment, including EMF detectors, capable of measuring electromagnetic fluctuations across multiple frequency ranges, digital voice recorders with enhanced sensitivity settings that could capture sounds below the normal threshold of human hearing, infrared thermometers for detecting temperature anomalies, night vision cameras with full spectrum capability, and even a Geiger counter to test for unusual radiation signatures that might indicate dimensional instabilities or temporal distortions. Martha Hendricks, who had become deeply and personally invested in the mystery after finding the diary that started this latest phase of investigation, insisted on accompanying me despite my serious concerns about her safety and my professional reluctance to involve civilians in potentially dangerous paranormal research. She argued passionately that as the person who had discovered the key piece of evidence that connected Chen's research to Michael's warnings, she had earned the right to see the investigation through to its conclusion, whatever that might entail. "I've been living with this mystery for months now," she told me during one of our planning sessions, her eyes bright with determination that reminded me of the passionate curiosity that had driven Robert Jackson to his doom. "I've read that boy's diary so many times that I can recite whole passages from memory. I've studied Chen's research until I understand his theories better than most graduate students understand their dissertations. I've dreamed about that family, worried about them, wondered what happened to them. I can't just sit at home while you go out there and possibly find the answers I've been searching for." Drill against my better judgment and every protocol I had developed for civilian safety during paranormal investigations, I agreed to let her come, but only after making her promise to follow my instructions without question once we reached the swamp, and after ensuring that she understood the very real dangers we might face. We departed for Blackwater Hollow on October 13th, 2007, exactly 22 years and 3 months after the Jackson family had made their final journey to that cursed place, driving through pre-dawn darkness in my modified research vehicle that was equipped with communication equipment, emergency medical supplies, and backup transportation in case our primary vehicle suffered the kind of mysterious mechanical failures that had been reported by previous investigators. The date was Martha's suggestion. She had noticed that many of the disappearances Chen had documented occurred in October, and she believed that timing might be crucial to understanding the supernatural cycles that governed the area and determined when the dimensional barriers were weakest. Her research into historical patterns had revealed that October represented a kind of peak season for paranormal activity in Blackwater Hollow, possibly related to seasonal changes in atmospheric pressure, solar radiation, or magnetic field fluctuations that created optimal conditions for whatever forces were responsible for the disappearances. As we drove through the familiar landscape of small towns, cypress swamps, and abandoned agricultural land that surrounded the Everglades, Martha talked nervously about her theories and expectations, her voice revealing both excitement and terror as we approached our destination. Our first night in Blackwater Hollow was unlike anything I had experienced during my previous visits to the region, which had been limited to daylight hours and brief overnight camping trips that I had always cut short when the atmosphere became too oppressive. We established our base camp at coordinates that Chen had marked as Observation Point Alpha, a small clearing about half a mile from where the Jackson van had been discovered, carefully chosen for its strategic advantages and relative safety. The location offered clear sightlines to 3 of the convergence points, while remaining far enough from the primary anchor point to avoid what Chen had described as direct spiritual interference that could affect electronic equipment and human consciousness. The clearing was surrounded by ancient cypress trees, draped with Spanish moss that created natural walls and provided some protection from the wind and rain that frequently swept across the swamp. As we set up our equipment and established our observation protocols, the normal sounds of the swamp, the deep grunting of alligators, the symphonic chorus of frogs, the rustle of nocturnal creatures moving through the dense vegetation provided a familiar background that helped calm our nerves and create a sense of normalcy in an environment that felt anything but normal. But as darkness fell across Blackwater Hollow like a heavy blanket, the familiar sounds gradually faded into an unnatural silence that seemed to press against our eardrums like physical weight, creating a sensation of pressure that made conversation difficult and breathing labored. Martha, who had been chattering nervously throughout the day about her expectations and theories, fell quiet as the oppressive atmosphere settled over our campsite like fog rolling in from the water. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an active presence that seemed to absorb noise and create a bubble of isolation around our camp, cutting us off from the normal world and leaving us suspended in a pocket of unreality where the usual rules of cause and effect no longer applied. Even the crackling of our campfire seemed muffled and distant, as if the sound was being filtered through layers of invisible interference before reaching our ears. The stars, which should have been brilliant in the clear sky above the swamp, appeared dim and distorted, twinkling in patterns that hurt to look at directly and created optical illusions that made the night sky seem to shift and move like a living thing. It was around midnight when we first detected activity on our electronic equipment, starting with subtle fluctuations that might have been dismissed as equipment malfunction if we hadn't been prepared for exactly this type of phenomena. The EMF detectors began registering massive electromagnetic fluctuations that spiked and fell in patterns that seemed almost rhythmic, like a supernatural heartbeat pulsing through the earth itself with a regularity that suggested intelligence rather than random natural phenomena. The readings were off the charts according to any normal baseline, showing electromagnetic activity levels that would have required industrial electrical equipment or powerful radio transmitters to generate. Yet we were in one of the most remote and technologically isolated areas of the Florida Everglades. The digital voice recorders picked up sounds that were barely within the range of human hearing, low-frequency vibrations that felt more than heard, creating a sensation of pressure in our chests that made breathing difficult and generated a kind of subsonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through our bones and internal organs. But it was the night vision cameras that captured the most disturbing evidence of what lurked in the depths of Blackwater Hollow, revealing a world of activity and intelligence that existed just beyond the reach of normal human perception. Through the green-tinted display of the night vision monitor, we watched in fascination and growing terror as shapes that defied rational explanation moved between the cypress trees surrounding our camp. gliding through the swamp with purpose and intelligence that clearly distinguished them from any known form of wildlife. These weren't animals. They moved with too much coordination, too much awareness of their environment, and their forms seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow given substance and consciousness. The shapes appeared to be roughly humanoid, but constantly changing, as if they were composed of some kind of energy or matter that couldn't maintain a stable physical form in our dimension. Sometimes they moved individually, sliding between trees with fluid grace that reminded me of dancers or martial artists, but other times they seemed to merge together into larger formations that pulsed and undulated like living geometric patterns. Martha gripped my arm so tightly I could feel her fingernails through my jacket as we observed these entities gliding soundlessly through the swamp, always staying just at the edge of our equipment's detection range, as if they understood the limitations of our technology and were deliberately avoiding direct observation. But the most chilling moment came when one of the shapes approached our camp directly, moving with deliberate intent rather than the random wandering we had observed in the others. It stopped just outside the circle of light from our campfire, and through the night vision camera we could see it clearly. A tall humanoid figure that seemed to be composed of darkness itself, with features that constantly shifted and blurred as if it were struggling to maintain physical form in our reality. For several minutes that felt like hours, it simply stood there, motionless and silent, and I had the unshakable feeling that it was studying us with the same intensity that we were observing it, analyzing our equipment, our intentions, and our potential threat to whatever existed in the deeper parts of the swamp. The temperature around our camp dropped noticeably during this confrontation, and the EMF readings spiked to levels that should have damaged our equipment, yet everything continued to function normally as if the laws of physics were being selectively suspended around us. Then, without warning or apparent cause, the entity began to move closer to our campfire, and as it stepped into the orange glow of the flames, both Martha and I gasped in horror at what we saw. The figure's face was a constantly changing mixture of features from different people: a woman's eyes, a man's mouth, a child's nose, an elderly person's wrinkled forehead, as if it were wearing masks made from the faces of its victims, cycling through identities like a supernatural slideshow of death and absorption. The features shifted every few seconds, never maintaining the same configuration long enough for us to identify any specific individual, but the overall effect was profoundly disturbing, and suggested that this entity was somehow composed of multiple human consciousness that had been merged or absorbed into a single supernatural being. But for just one terrifying instant, the features stabilized into a recognizable pattern, and I found myself looking directly into the face of Robert Jackson, the missing father who had led his family into this nightmare 22 years ago. His expression bearing the same confident enthusiasm that had driven him to explore the mysteries of Blackwater Hollow, despite every warning he had received. The entity that wore Robert Jackson's face opened its mouth and spoke, but the voice that emerged wasn't human in any recognizable sense. It was a sound like wind whistling through hollow bones, like water dripping in empty caverns, like the final breath of something dying alone in the dark, harmonized with undertones that suggested multiple voices speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, and the words seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the water until they surrounded us completely, creating a supernatural surround sound effect that made it impossible to determine the actual source of the communication. "The boy tried to warn you, the writer tried to warn you, but you came anyway, just like all the others who thought they could solve mysteries that were never meant to be solved by living minds." Martha was trembling so violently that I could hear her teeth chattering, despite the warm October night. But she somehow found the courage to speak, her voice barely audible above the supernatural cacophony that was building around us like an orchestra of the damned, tuning their instruments for a cosmic performance. "What happened to the Jackson family?" she whispered, her words carried by the still air to the entity that stood just beyond our firelight. "What did you do to them?" The creature's face shifted again, cycling through different features before settling on what I recognized as Linda Jackson's gentle eyes and warm smile, but twisted into an expression of infinite sadness and rage that spoke of decades of imprisonment and suffering. "We didn't do anything to them," it replied, and now the voice carried harmonics of multiple people speaking in unison, creating a choral effect that was both beautiful and terrifying. They came to us willingly, called by the voices in the water, drawn by the promise of secrets that mortal minds weren't meant to understand, just as you have come, just as the writer came. Just as they all come in the end, following the same irresistible compulsion that has been drawing seekers to this place for over a century. The entity gestured with one shadowy arm toward the deeper parts of the swamp, and suddenly the water around our campsite began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence that revealed shapes moving beneath the surface. Other entities, other trapped souls, perhaps the consciousness of everyone who had ever disappeared in Blackwater Hollow. What I learned in those final hours before dawn changed everything. I thought I knew about life, death, and the thin barriers that separate our world from realms of existence that human language cannot adequately describe, realities that exist parallel to our own, but operate according to entirely different rules of physics, consciousness, and identity. The entity revealed that Blackwater Hollow was what it called a confluence point, a location where multiple dimensions intersected and where the souls of those who died under specific conditions could become trapped between worlds, unable to move on to whatever comes after death, but also unable to return to life. The Jackson family hadn't simply died in the swamp. They had been absorbed into something larger and more complex, their consciousness and memories becoming part of a collective entity that had been growing stronger and more coherent with each disappearance over the past century, feeding on the mental energy and life force of everyone who became lost in the dimensional maze that existed beneath the surface of normal reality. "We are many," the creature explained, its face now cycling rapidly through dozens of different features, creating a kaleidoscope effect that was hypnotic and nauseating to watch. "But we remember being few. We remember being Robert, who sought knowledge that should have remained hidden, who ignored every warning because his curiosity was stronger than his caution. We remember being Linda, who followed love into darkness because she trusted her husband's judgment more than her own instincts. We remember being Sarah, who questioned the wisdom of the expedition but could not resist the pull of family loyalty and adolescent adventure. We remember being Michael, who saw the truth but couldn't save his family, who tried to leave warnings but was trapped before he could escape. We remember being Emma, who played with shadows until the shadows played with her, whose innocence made her the easiest target for entities that feed on pure life energy. The revelation that the missing family members weren't dead, but somehow still conscious within this supernatural amalgamation, was more horrifying than any explanation I had previously considered, because it meant they were aware, suffering, and had been experiencing this nightmare existence for over 2 decades without hope of escape or peace. The entity explained that Michael's diary had been its own doing, a desperate attempt by the boy's consciousness, still partially separate within the collective, to warn others away from Blackwater Hollow and prevent additional souls from being trapped in the dimensional prison that the swamp had become. But the warnings had backfired, instead drawing investigators like Chen and myself to the area during peak manifestation periods, when the dimensional barriers were weakest and the risk of absorption was highest. "The boy's fragment grows weaker with each passing year," the creature said, its voice now carrying notes of what might have been regret or sadness. Soon he will be fully integrated, and there will be no more warnings, no more desperate attempts to save others from our fate. That is why you must leave now, while you still can choose your own destiny, while your consciousness is still entirely your own, and you retain the free will to walk away from mysteries that were never meant to be solved. But even as it urged us to flee, I could see hunger in its ever-changing eyes, a desperate need for new consciousness to feed the collective entity that the Jackson family had become. Fresh minds to absorb, and personalities to integrate into its growing supernatural intelligence. Martha, who had been silent for several minutes while processing the impossible revelations we were hearing, suddenly stood up from our observation position behind the cameras and recording equipment, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were in some kind of trance. "Show me," she said in a voice that was steady despite her obvious terror, her words carrying an authority that surprised me, coming from a 67-year-old widow who had stumbled into this investigation by accident. "Show me what really happened to them. I want to see the truth with my own eyes, not just hear descriptions that my mind can barely comprehend. If they're really still conscious, still suffering, then maybe there's something that can be done to help them." Before I could stop her or even fully process what she was planning, she was walking toward the water, drawn by some compulsion that I couldn't understand, moving with the same determined purpose that had led her to explore that dangerous attic where she first found Michael's diary. The entity smiled with Robert Jackson's mouth, and I knew that we had made a terrible mistake in coming to this place, that our investigation had led us directly into a trap that had been centuries in the making. What happened next defied every scientific principle I had ever learned and challenged every rational belief I had held about the nature of reality itself, forcing me to confront possibilities that I had never seriously considered despite years of investigating paranormal phenomena. As Martha approached the edge of the dark water, the surface began to ripple and glow with an eerie phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from deep below, creating patterns of light that moved in spirals and geometric configurations that hurt to look at directly, but were impossible to ignore. The entity gestured with one shadowy arm, and suddenly the water became transparent, like a window into another dimension or a mirror that reflected not our world, but some parallel reality where different laws of physics applied. Through this supernatural portal, we could see the Jackson family as they had been on their final day, alive, breathing, moving, but trapped in a realm that existed parallel to our own, a pocket dimension where they had been imprisoned for over 2 decades. They were gathered around their campsite in what appeared to be a perfect recreation of Blackwater Hollow, but the colors were wrong, too vivid and saturated, like a movie where the contrast has been turned up too high, and the shadows fell at impossible angles that created optical illusions and spatial distortions that made my eyes water and my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. Robert was studying his maps with the same obsessive intensity he had shown in life, but now his eyes held knowledge of cosmic truths that human minds weren't designed to comprehend, and his face bore the expression of someone who had learned secrets that he desperately wished he could forget. Linda was tending to a campfire that burned with flames of every color simultaneously, creating light that illuminated nothing and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, defying every law of optics and physics that governed our reality. Sarah sat writing in a journal with a pen that dripped liquid starlight, documenting experiences that no terrestrial vocabulary could adequately describe. Her teenage face aged by exposure to knowledge that had never been meant for human consciousness. Michael was looking directly at us through the dimensional barrier, his 13-year-old face bearing an expression of ancient wisdom and infinite sorrow that belonged on someone who had lived for centuries rather than a boy who had died before his 14th birthday. His eyes met mine through the supernatural window, and I felt a shock of recognition and communication that bypassed normal speech and went directly into my consciousness. Without words, he conveyed a message of desperate urgency, that the entity was lying about their situation, that escape was possible but required specific knowledge and actions that could only be taken by someone from our dimension, and that time was running out before the next peak manifestation period made any rescue attempt impossible. And Emma was playing with creatures that looked like children, but were composed entirely of mist and moonbeams, laughing with a sound like silver bells, echoing in empty cathedrals, her innocent joy providing a heartbreaking contrast to the cosmic horror of their situation. But even in her play, I could see the exhaustion and despair that came from decades of imprisonment in a realm where nothing ever changed and no new experiences were possible. "They exist in all moments simultaneously now," the entity explained as we watched this impossible scene unfold before us, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the Jackson family themselves, as if they were being forced to narrate their own imprisonment. Past, present, and future have no meaning in their realm. They experience their disappearance and discovery of the diary and your investigation all at once, in an eternal loop of knowledge and regret that provides entertainment for intelligences that exist outside normal time and space. This is why the boy could draw a map of a house he had never seen, because in his dimension he witnesses everything that will ever happen in connection to their fate, including events that won't occur for decades in your timeline. The implications of this revelation were staggering and forced me to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the nature of time, causality, and human consciousness. If the Jackson family existed outside normal temporal flow, if they could perceive events across decades simultaneously, then their disappearance wasn't just a tragedy. It was a window into aspects of reality that science had never dreamed of exploring. A glimpse into dimensions where consciousness could exist independently of physical matter, and where the boundaries between past, present, and future became meaningless. But as I watched the family trapped in their parallel existence, I also understood the true horror of their situation. They were conscious, aware, and completely helpless to change their fate or effectively warn others about the dangers of Blackwater Hollow. Michael's diary had been not just a warning, but a desperate plea from someone experiencing eternal torment, watching helplessly as other families and investigators followed the same path that had led to his family's doom, knowing exactly what would happen, but being powerless to prevent it. The psychological torture of such existence was beyond anything I could imagine. To be aware of every moment that had led to their capture, to witness every future victim walking into the same trap, to possess the knowledge needed to prevent additional tragedies but be unable to communicate that knowledge effectively to the living world. Martha was now standing at the very edge of the supernatural water, close enough that the phosphorescence was reflecting off her face and giving her skin an otherworldly glow that made her look like she was already partially absorbed into the entity's realm. "Can they be saved?" she asked the entity, her voice filled with compassion for people she had never met, but whose story had become inextricably connected to her own life through months of research and emotional investment. "Is there any way to free them from this prison and allow them to find peace?" The creature considered her question for a long moment, its face cycling through the features of all 5 Jackson family members, as if consulting with each of their absorbed consciousness before responding. When it finally spoke, its voice carried what sounded like genuine sadness, the accumulated grief of hundreds of trapped souls who had been hoping for rescue for decades or even centuries. "There is a way," the entity finally admitted, "but it requires sacrifice that few mortals would willingly make, and success is far from guaranteed. The barrier between dimensions can be temporarily weakened during peak manifestation periods, allowing consciousness to flow in both directions between realities. Someone from your realm could theoretically enter their dimension and guide them back to the living world. But the process would require the rescuer to take their place in the collective entity, becoming the anchor that holds the dimensional prison together. The Jackson family could return to your world, but whoever saves them would become trapped in their parallel existence, experiencing all moments simultaneously for eternity. Martha turned to look at me, and I could see in her eyes that she was seriously considering this impossible proposition, weighing the value of 5 lives against her own with the calculating objectivity of someone who had made peace with her own mortality. "Martha, no," I said, recognizing the determined expression that had led her to explore that dangerous attic where she first found Michael's diary. The same stubborn curiosity that had brought us to this moment of supernatural revelation. "You can't be thinking about sacrificing yourself for people you've never even met, people who died decades ago." But even as I spoke the words, I knew that she had already made her decision, that the same compassion and determination that had driven her to seek answers about the Jackson family would now compel her to attempt their rescue, regardless of the personal cost. "They're not strangers to me," she replied softly, her voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had found their true purpose in life. "I've been carrying their story in my heart for months now. I've read Michael's diary so many times that I feel like I know them personally, like they're family members I've lost and need to bring home. And besides," she added with a sad smile that broke my heart, "I'm 67 years old, widowed, with no children of my own, and no one who depends on me. My life is basically over, but theirs could just be beginning again if someone is willing to pay the price for their freedom." The entity watched our conversation with expressions that cycled between hope and hunger, and I realized that it genuinely wanted to be freed from its supernatural prison, but was also desperate for the fresh consciousness that Martha's sacrifice would provide, new mental energy to feed the collective intelligence that sustained its existence between dimensions. "There is more," it said, its voice now carrying urgent undertones that suggested time was running short for any rescue attempt. "The writer discovered part of the truth before he was taken. The cycle can be broken, but not through simple substitution. The real solution requires understanding why Blackwater Hollow became a confluence point in the first place, healing the original wound that created the dimensional weakness that traps souls in this place." This revelation changed everything because it suggested that there might be a way to save not just the Jackson family, but potentially centuries of trapped souls, to close the supernatural portal permanently and prevent future disappearances. But it also meant that Martha might be walking into a trap, that the entity was using her compassion to lure her into the dimensional prison while concealing the true nature of what would be required to actually solve the mystery of Blackwater Hollow. Before I could physically restrain her or convince her to reconsider her decision, Martha stepped into the glowing water, and immediately the phosphorescence began to swirl around her legs like liquid light, creating patterns that spiraled up her body and seemed to penetrate her skin with energy that was both beautiful and terrifying to observe. The sensation must have been extraordinary because her face lit up with wonder despite the terror of what she was attempting, her expression suggesting that she was experiencing something beyond normal human perception. "I can feel them," she whispered, her voice carrying new harmonics as the dimensional barrier began to affect her speech and consciousness. "I can feel their fear, their hope, their gratitude. Michael is trying to tell me something important, something the entity doesn't want us to know." She paused, listening to voices that only she could hear, her face taking on the concentrated expression of someone receiving crucial information through supernatural channels. Then she looked back at me with urgency in her eyes that had taken on an otherworldly glow. "He says the cycle can be broken, but not the way the entity described. The real solution requires understanding why Blackwater Hollow became a confluence point in the first place, healing the original trauma that created the dimensional weakness. The entity's face shifted to an expression of alarm, suggesting that Michael's consciousness had revealed information that the collective intelligence preferred to keep hidden, secrets that could potentially undermine its control over the dimensional prison. "There was an original tragedy here," Martha continued, her voice becoming stronger even as she waded deeper into the supernatural waters that seemed to be transforming her on a cellular level. "Something that happened before any of the documented disappearances, something that wounded the fabric of reality itself and created the conditions that allow souls to become trapped between dimensions. If that original wound can be healed, all the trapped consciousness can be freed simultaneously without anyone having to take their place. The revelation that there might be a way to save everyone without requiring additional sacrifice was exactly what I had been hoping to hear, but it also raised new questions about what kind of trauma could be powerful enough to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. What had happened in Blackwater Hollow in the distant past that had created these supernatural conditions? What kind of original sin or cosmic violation had transformed a normal swamp into a dimensional prison that had been claiming victims for over a century? But as Martha moved deeper into the phosphorescent water, I realized that she might be walking into a trap orchestrated by the entity to claim her consciousness while revealing nothing about the true solution to Blackwater Hollow's curse. The collective intelligence had had decades to perfect its techniques of manipulation and deception, and it might be using Martha's compassion and Michael's desperate communications to lure her into the dimensional prison where she would become just another absorbed consciousness, her knowledge and memories added to the supernatural database that the entity used to trap future victims. The water around Martha began to glow more intensely, and through its phosphorescent surface I could see other faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all belonging to people who had disappeared in Blackwater Hollow over the decades, their expressions showing a mixture of warning and welcome that suggested they were caught between wanting to save Martha from their fate and desperately hoping that she might be the key to their own liberation. But Martha pressed forward, driven by a compassion that transcended rational self-preservation and a determination that reminded me of the same qualities that had made the Jackson family such effective explorers before their curiosity led them into supernatural danger. As she reached the center of the supernatural pool, something extraordinary happened that defied every law of physics I had ever studied. The water around her began to part, creating a dry pathway that led directly to where the Jackson family stood in their parallel dimension, a bridge between worlds that allowed direct access to the realm where they had been imprisoned for over 2 decades. The entity roared in frustration, its voice now containing harmonics of genuine fear and rage, as it realized that its carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. "She cannot cross over," it shrieked, its face cycling rapidly through hundreds of different features as multiple absorbed consciousness began to assert their individual identities. "The barrier exists to protect your world from ours. If the dimensions merge completely, both realities will collapse into chaos, destroying everything that exists in either realm." But Martha had already stepped onto the impossible pathway, walking between worlds with a determination that defied every law of physics and metaphysics, her figure becoming translucent as she moved deeper into the space between dimensions. Behind her, the normal world of Blackwater Hollow began to flicker and fade like a television losing its signal, while ahead of her, the Jackson family's parallel existence grew more solid and real with each step she took toward their dimensional prison. I realized that I was witnessing something unprecedented in human history, not just a rescue mission, but a fundamental alteration of reality itself that could have consequences far beyond saving one missing family from decades of supernatural imprisonment. The very fabric of space and time was being rewritten around us, and I had no idea whether Martha's intervention would result in salvation or catastrophe on a cosmic scale that could affect the entire structure of existence itself. What Martha discovered in that realm between worlds, and what ultimately happened to both her and the Jackson family, represents the most profound mystery I have ever encountered in my years of investigating unexplained phenomena. The truth about Blackwater Hollow's origins, the real reason why souls become trapped there, and the cosmic implications of what occurred that night in October 2007 will haunt me for the rest of my life. But that story, and the revelation of what Martha's sacrifice actually accomplished, is something that deserves to be told properly, with all the respect and wonder that such an extraordinary act of human courage demands. What would you have done in Martha's position, knowing that you could potentially save a family, but might lose yourself in the process? Do you believe some mysteries are worth risking everything to solve? Or are there truths that humanity isn't ready to understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to know what really happened when Martha stepped between dimensions and what she discovered about the original trauma that created Blackwater Hollow's supernatural prison, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the conclusion of this story will challenge everything you think you know about life, death, and the invisible forces that shape our reality.